Hi, Sue. Hi, Jill.
Hi.
Hi, hello Emma.
Thank you so much for agreeing to have a little chat with me. It's really helpful.
No problem.
Our pleasure.
First of all, can I ask you the question? Can you remember what brought you over to Empowered?
Well, before we started chatting today, we were thinking back, and because we've been supported by Empowered for best part of 2.5, 3 years, it took some digging into our own grey matter. At a time when mum's dementia was becoming more acute, my sister and I were kind of scouting around for any support. And of course we Googled, and I do recall being at the Langworthy Cornerstone where there's a wonderful table of leaflets, and I picked something up. I did some research online. I do recall that my dad would ask very direct questions of mum, who was struggling with those questions that were very closed, yes or no questions. And there was something that I saw online. I must have Googled and found a Facebook video or a YouTube video, and I think if the term was invitation to respond, that concept seemed so relevant. I shared that with Sue, that video, and thought as to whether that notion in and of itself was a good way of thinking about talking to mum, not questioning, but an invitation to respond. And from there, I looked at Empowered. And, if there could be a support body, an organisation that basically had a strapline that described my family, then Empowered is it. And it was, you'll know it better, Emma, of course, but it was something like supporting the families of those, caring for those with dementia from Salford. And whilst I'm speaking to you from Herefordshire, where I am now, I hope you can still hear, I've got my Salfordian roots. Mum and Dad still lived in the same house that we were brought up in, and Sue's still in Salford. So really it had the makings of an organisation that could help Sue and I and Mum and Dad.
Yeah, so I'll just carry on, sort of, very similar to what Jill was saying. I can remember her sharing a video, which I think was, like you say, something even on Twitter, something like that. And I showed it to my eldest son, and I showed it to my dad, and I was trying to explain to him about how we may try and think a bit more carefully about how we question mum, and how often, when you don't realise it, you start a conversation with a question, and often do you remember, because you're trying to generate conversation, and as soon as you've started saying it, you sort of like, and my dad sort of agreed, oh yeah, this is good. But I think maybe because of our different backgrounds, Jill and myself, we sort of found that concept a little bit easier to understand and to grasp. And at the time I was working as a teaching assistant in a primary school, so I had a lot of different tools from my work life that I could adapt to mum. And at the time, like Jill said, you're just at a loss. You don't know really how you got through what you got through until you look back. And it was just of anyone that can help us, because, we were in COVID, and actually I think we did quite well as a family getting the support that we did get compared to many others. But even so, just day to day, you don't know how you're going to get through hour to hour sometimes, let alone like week to week. So anyone, like literally anyone that can help, please do. So anything that was offered, we graciously accepted.
And I think I was the one who sent an email through to Emma and presented the situation and asked what was available. I recall that, as I say, there was a funnel of where do we go for help, and it was narrowed down. And we were also, we had occupational therapists from the oh gosh, what would it be called? The older adults
mental health
team. Yeah. So we were reaching out to see what was available, whether that might be that mum would go somewhere at a day centre, for example, or would somebody come and sit in with mum while dad could go out shopping? But really it was empowered in two ways, which I know you've not asked us this question in particular, but when I think in a nutshell, it was how we were able to communicate with mum better and in a more rewarding way. And then through, that's the empowered conversations, and then empowered carers, the time that we've had being mentored, supported, has really helped us to, well, I won't say too much about it now, but that's just been ongoing support, and that's practicalities. It's a space to speak freely and reflect on how things are going, and to have our thought process reflected back, so that we were maybe edging towards some decisions, but we perhaps didn't really know we were getting towards those decisions until our Phil from Empowered Carers helped us to realise that.
Wow, thank you so much for that. And I suppose if we think about those sessions with Phil, obviously you're not in Salford, Gill, and Sue, you are in Salford. Were you both on the session at the same time? How did that work out? And was Dad involved? Was he in there as well?
I'd say for the majority of them, and especially the initial ones, it was just myself and Gill, both at the same time, but from different locations with Phil. So like a three-way conversation like we are having now, via Zoom. And there were some sessions, just a couple, where I think me and Dad shared a screen. So I think I was with Dad at his house, and I'd taken my laptop and we did it. And then there were also a small number of sessions where it was just Dad and Phil. And I know that my dad really sort of valued Phil as an expert, his expertise, he's been through it, his professional previous experience. And my dad was a bit not sure about what he was going to get out of it. And if you asked him, he might sort of give you a different view, it was just nice to have a chat. But I think he actually got far more than he may have realised out of it. He opened up to Phil a little bit. And again, it's a different dynamic than it is speaking to your daughters. And that was good. It was good that Dad had the opportunity to do that. He did need us, or he needed me, because I was able to set up the Zoom for him. That would have been a bit too far. But most of the time it was a three-way conversation. And then there was maybe half a dozen, I'd say, just Phil and Dad. And the other thing that we did with Zoom with Paul, the actual course, do you want me to talk a little bit about that, or do you want to cover that separately? Because to me, they're like two separate things in a way.
Well, let's talk about them separately, but let's talk about if we didn't have Zoom, then Gill, you would have been very much like down in Herefordshire, maybe like driving up to support at weekends, but it was COVID, so we were a bit restricted on where we could move and whatever. I just think that because of Zoom and because of the way that we set up Empowered Carers, it meant that you could have an active sort of role and be part of these discussions and this support for Sue, who obviously is just down the road from mum and dad. So how was that for you, Gill?
Now we've more or less moved on from COVID times, it's incredible to think back, and the genuine worry I had about moving about the country. I think now, if I know now what I know, then I think I would have, there was a period where I didn't visit, and then there was a period when I did visit, and I thought, and then I also caught COVID, and I mean, this is just a personal reflection on how it affected my horizons. So the things that so when I wasn't visiting, and that must have been months I didn't visit, maybe 20.
I think it was March till it was the end of August, I think, or it was August, yeah.
So in terms of what I felt able to do, there was things that talking to mum and dad on the phone a lot, talking with Sue a lot, constant communication, talking. I felt that I knew anyway, but Phil also sort of reinforced the fact that with the flexibility of my working life, I could take half an hour to get on the phone to the social worker, to the pharmacy, to make that appointment with the older adults team, occupational health therapist. So I busied myself with admin and that kind of the list of things to when you're checking in on somebody and caring for them. Participating though through Zoom in both the empowered conversation and empowered carers, you're absolutely right. It would have not been possible without many organizations going online and Zoom becoming a word that everybody knows and didn't previously, and Teams and so on. And it worked well. We've got great connectivity today as we're talking. And I seem to remember that certainly, getting people together, and the number of people in empowered conversations, there must have been, say, 8 or 10 of us, and me, Sue, Phil, or Sue, Dad, Phil, it would have been hard if we didn't have this virtual opportunity. We're still yet to meet Phil in person. I'm sure we'll be on Salford Precinct one day, Sue, and we'll see him. And
we'll only know him this day anyway. I won't recognise him within his head.
Yeah. Do you remember that time he got locked out, or he'd locked his wife out or something?
Yeah. Well, we used to say, like, when he'd come on, we'd be like, "Oh, Phil, I've not seen that room." And one time he was in the loft, and then they'd be like, "What he's done?" Well, yeah, I think his wife had locked herself out, and yeah.
Fantastic. I'm going to tell him that I'm actually seeing him on Friday, and we still are in the virtual world. So he lives over Oldham way, so we're still in the virtual world. So I don't really get to see him that often face to face, but I'm seeing him on Friday, so I'm going to mention that I've met up with you too.
Yeah, and then sometimes it'd obviously be in a bedroom, because there'd be like all these fitted wardrobes behind him, and we'd always comment. I mean, one thing I would say about the Zoom as well, when you are, and I liked hearing the stories, especially that would have been about August when we started that thing with Paul. It's so hard to actually get any time to have conversation where you're on your own. So realistically, if we'd have had to travel somewhere, I probably wouldn't have been able to join in, So the fact it was at Zoom, you could do it, or you could make sure that somebody was, looking out for mum, and that really gave us, and I'm sure other people, the opportunity to join in, because actually getting somewhere and making sure that your loved one's cared for while you have this conversation is really tricky. So, Zoom or whatever, Teams, other brands are available. It was a really good opportunity, and like a real valuable insight that it isn't just you, and actually you feel like it's you, but it isn't you. And just nice to see other people, and everyone was at different stages. So yeah, that was great.
Can you remember, I know obviously we've talked about invitation to respond, that was sort of our way into our conversation today, but can you remember what you sort of took away from the Empowered Conversations course?
Yeah, I thought quite a lot about body language when, as a learning, I'm in my 50s and I've spent 50 odd years communicating, but I really do feel I benefit from being reflective and thoughtful on my communication style, especially when it was in relation to mum. It could be towards the children or work colleagues, but it was specifically, I thought about body language, and I might get emotional at some points in this, but how I would sit in front of mum. I would go up to their parlour, go up to Langley Road in Salford, sit in their parlour, and I would sit on the puffy, that faded puffy in front of mum's chair.
Yeah.
And I make sure my body was really open. I would, lean forward, touch her hands. So everything about the way I was presenting myself was suggesting familiarity, even if, although at that point when mum was still at home, she always recognised me. I don't mean because of that, but just to show I was kind of a safe, warm, approachable, because I'm giving out all of those gestures to her. The other thing as well was this perhaps came from the conversations as opposed to it being, shall we say, a module, was the use of singing. And I had a repertoire of various little songs and ditties, a couple of lines here and there, that I would use when I was perhaps coaxing mum into allowing us to care for her. And that might mean taking her upstairs to the loo. So we'd have a going up the stairs song, and then we'd have a going down the stairs song. And I won't burst into it now, but, you know, from the 60s, you know, we're going downtown. I said I won't burst into song, and that would help mum to know she was going down the stairs. And if I washed her hair, what would I sing when I was washing her hair? So those are real specifics, but for a period of time on a certain plateau in how mum was, they really worked. And that would be the kind of thing we might exchange in the forum. But then there was also, perhaps, shall I say, sort of teacher-led in thoughts, and we did some exercises about, as well, a bit of self-care, what we were looking forward to doing after we could go out again, that kind of thing. So I guess then three things, like singing, body language, and reflecting on ourselves as the carers.
And when you were talking about, you know, you're sitting in the parlour on the puff in front of mum, how do you think mum was responding to you? How different was there a notable difference that you picked up from mum around, you know, you being very aware of your non-verbal?
I'd say that if I went up for a weekend, I would have to be really on my game. I felt like an actress on the stage. I was only there for a finite time at the weekends in between working life and home life. So I'd need the energy to deliver that as best I could, to listen and communicate as much as possible. Sometimes it worked, and sometimes I can't recall any specifics, but I'd think that really did work. Bringing an object and having the object, and the object itself would be the invitation to respond, and it would spark something, and it would work. And it's not an exact science, because obviously I didn't do a control where I sat like that, but always I guess, because Sue has said as well, being a teaching assistant, I've done some teaching, and I work in sales and marketing and running a business. So you've got to be on your game. And it was how I delivered that particular performance isn't right, but to be very conscious of being the right energy level, communicating in the right way, and using a few tricks of the trade that I'd absorbed during the time on Empowered Conversations, Empowered Conversations.
I suppose for you, Gill, because you had, just like you said, that finite time, it's a bit different to you, Sue, because like you must have been aware, I really want it to work. I really want to have that connection with mum, because I'm only here this weekend and I can't get up for another couple of weeks. Whereas Sue, obviously you could like nip down, see mum and dad. So what was it that you took from the course, Sue? You said about connecting with other caregivers and maybe listening to their experiences.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Yeah. I actually think it would have been wonderful to have done that, maybe even say 2 years before, because I think the window of where mum was with a dementia, she'd got into quite a real sort of really negative towards my dad particularly, and she wasn't open a lot of the time to, I don't know, I'm trying to think of how to word it. There were times when nothing really seemed to sort of work, and just getting through that sort of day was the achievement. I was aware quite a lot of how important your body language is, your non-verbal cues from my work. So I did always try to incorporate that. Keeping things simple, like not bombarding with information. So there was, for me, lots on the course were things that I knew, but I hadn't put it into perspective in terms of using those skills with you know, with mum, with somebody with dementia. I also remember that he had a few videos that he showed, because it's actually about two and a bit years ago, isn't it, this? And they were like pencil drawings, and sometimes to see something visually is really useful. And I'm sure it was something about how almost like
it's Alison Ray's work. I've got one of her DVDs here.
Yeah, something like it was an empty hole, and just like everything that you're saying is just going down, down, down. So it doesn't matter that you've literally told them 10 seconds ago, because it's not retained. It's just, you know, anything recent was just going into this empty hole. So I found those, although I can't quite remember the specifics, but I knew at the time, especially, and we had little tasks where we drew things. And I can remember there was one where I drew what I thought was quite an elaborate drawing of me and my mum down at Costa Coffee at the Keys, and I think I was like pushing my mum round in the wheelchair. But also one thing I liked was we had the opportunity to sort of, you know, how's your week been, and you'd listen into others, and you know, people, there were different kinds of dementia, different stages of dementia. You might have a wife caring for a husband, which again is a different dynamic than, you know, daughter and mother, or some of the others. There was another participant whose mother was already in care, and it's almost like it was, in some ways you thought, oh wow, we're doing really, really well, you know, and then in other ways you'd sort of think, oh, you know, this is going to get worse, and you don't believe it can ever get any worse, because you think this is as bad as it is until things go. But for me, it was something that I actually put side to side for myself. You know, it was almost like a treat to do a course, because my life at that stage was, I worked throughout COVID because the schools were open. So it was a case of sort of going to work, going straight and having maybe 3 hours with mum and dad, and then just coming home and repeat. But that particular hour and a half was like a break. It was a bit of respite for me. And then obviously you know, you are taking in quite a lot, and you're trying to incorporate that wherever you can. But I actually think if we'd have come across that, I don't know what you think, Gill, maybe 18 months earlier, we could have had more impact, because we'd have had that awareness, and maybe mum was at a stage where she would have been slightly more responsive to that. She hadn't quite got into such the negative cycle that she was at the stage we started. But
yeah,
it was really invaluable. And it was just, I really enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it.
Yeah,
I can tell you both
as well, weren't we?
Say that again, Gill.
We joined every class.
Yeah.
You've both got really strong, vivid memories of the course, and considering it was like over 2 years ago, it obviously did have an impact. So I'm really glad that it did, and I'm thank you so much for sharing those. If you were going to sort of describe empowered to maybe some caregivers who, you know, might be going through some of the things that you went through as a family, how would you describe it, and how would you encourage them to get involved?
We've met with Phil through Empowered Carers on everything from a weekly, 2 weekly, and then monthly and 6 weekly basis as time has moved on. And we've met with Phil over a video link, and that has created from Sue and I did absolutely the majority of the talking. I think if you were a bit like in football where they talk about possession and so on, and 80-20 had the ball, definitely that. And so you can see from that analysis that Phil was creating a space for Sue and I to talk, and that might have been some of the realizations of how we might bring in someone from a sitting service to sit with mum, the pros and cons of trying to get her to go to daycare, the pros and cons of taking her out for a coffee or an ice cream, and how it had gone, and then some of how we were seeing mum behave with dad, so we could talk about that. Ultimately, one of the biggest decisions that was made was that mum went into respite care in a residential home. That then, a few months later, became a permanent arrangement. And when we'd started out imagining and hoping that mum would be at home all of her days, but there was no, it was a space where conversations where Sue and I could talk about how things had got, and I won't just say how bad things have got, just had progressed. It was a different stage in mum's journey on dementia. Phil never made a recommendation of what we needed to do. I'm thinking about this now, he didn't, did he? He was able to play back to us, confirm that's a tough decision, or you've advocated strongly, or you've sought the best for your mum. How do you believe you would say your decisions? If you were to say them out loud, have those been the right decisions? And he facilitated all of that. When mum, what was one of the biggest decisions he helped us to make, as well as mum going into respite and then a permanent arrangement, was we then sought a different living arrangement for mum, where she went from a residential home which had a dementia speciality, and it was more for people perhaps more advanced. And as soon as mum went into the residential home, she settled, she became calm, she responded to uniformed caregivers, she started to eat and take her tablets and take her inhalers and drink at the right time. So she was really fitting in and felt safer in that environment. So that meant that she was less agitated, aggressive, upset, confused. And so the home she initially started in was perhaps too high level for her. So she moved into a different one. And it was for us to use Phil as a sounding board about what was right and wrong about the existing residential home. That again was something that, even practically sitting down and having a face-to-face conversation when everyone's busy, and finding time to do that in a structured way where we're in a room by ourselves, each one of us, and we can listen and discuss things. That's been brilliant. I wouldn't necessarily, the conversations and decisions wouldn't have happened in the same way. Ultimately, we knew we wanted the best for mum, of course, and for dad. But for somebody to guide us in a not over advisory, but sometimes we say, is this how it might be and what might happen then? And he would give us the benefit of his experience, but without in any way telling us what to do. He led the horses to water. There we are, there's a mixed metaphor, I'm sure.
I'd say it just invaluable, really. If you would just like to use one line, it's been invaluable. I mean, some of the Zoom calls, we used it to the last second. You remember it would be like, oh, we've got 10 seconds, and it'd go, because it was an opportunity for us to say how things had been. And a lot of the time, quite a lot of the conversation was quite difficult, often quite negative from our point of view. And Phil would listen, and he'd sort of reflect back. He said, what I'm hearing is, and then he'd sort of repeat back, and he'd sort of break it down. And I suppose when you're in that situation, you need that outside person, and Phil is somebody who was outside, and we didn't realise at the time what a wealth of experience he had, because he didn't really sort of say, oh, do you know I've got 35 years as a, we've since found that out. And I mean, we struck gold, really, because he's got a wealth of experience, first-hand knowledge, and he would sort of, like you say, guide us, but without trying to influence us. So getting us to reflect and to realise what we had done. And he would be really positive, you know, and say, you know, remember, this is what you've done, remember how you were feeling. And it sort of like, I know, especially when he spoke about my dad, he would say how sort of drained and exhausted dad was. He wasn't saying that, but he was making us realise. And I think even trying to make my dad realise he needed something for himself. And I don't know, he was just quite masterful in how he managed to sort of help us and guide us. And it's been a big journey. I mean, when we first started, like Gill said, the last thing we wanted, and Mum was very clear about not wanting to go into a care home, you know, or be put away. But you can't really, as much as you try and keep Mum, you know, in our case, Mum's wishes, everything just sort of ran away from us, you know. Things became untenable, really. And, you know, we'd exhausted everything that we could. And he gave us experience and his expertise. And he was a bit of a sounding board. I can remember us talking to him about care homes and things that might have happened. And even when Mum was at different stages, like, have you come across this before, Phil, when somebody who's been married to somebody for 50 odd years turns around and accuses them of having affairs and tells you that they hate them, and you know, he would tell us things that he'd come across. So, you know, we used to sort of look forward to that opportunity to use Phil, not as a sounding board, because that sounds quite negative, but just as a non-judgmental outside professional who wasn't coming at it from any angle other than to support. And that really was my only support I got as a carer. You know, I had lots of people who felt sorry for me, and I'm going to get upset now, you know. Oh, I don't know how you do it. How are you keeping on going? And actually, you don't know how you're doing it. You're doing it because there is no other choice, and you love that person very much, and you only want the best for them. And that was the only true sort of care that a carer was getting, from my point of view, if I think about it now. I don't know what you think, Jill.
Yeah, I think that if I imagine that for, say, a husband and wife, and they're both still at home and one's caring for the other, they might be minded to go to some kind of they do a dementia tea dance here in Herefordshire, but that wouldn't fit the bill for us. So what support we had through Empowered, although it helped us to stay really close, me, Dad and Sue, and for Sue and I to be very practical. I know I sort of my practical list of all the things that needed doing. We go through that as well. So I suppose that there wasn't the opportunity for me to benefit from other things that carer support here. So Phil, I suppose I go back, you know, the practical side as well as the emotional side as well. He offered both, and now I'm thinking back, he would say things like, you've done your very best. Sorry, I mean, Mum's gone now, but at the time, you're doing your very best for your mum, you know, and he would remind us of that, which is sort of, it was sometimes hard. It was hard, but there was somebody else saying, I suppose, not pat on the back, not well done, but without it being in any way condescending, or, you know, you've done well. And I don't mean
almost he validated what you were doing and the decisions you were making and how hard it was. You know, that validation, someone just saying, actually, you've done a good job. Because quite often we can't see
you couldn't have done any more, or you've and remember, I think about the care home, the residential home that one Mum was in for the last year and a bit, we told him some of the activities and the food and the decor and the bedroom and the activities they got up to, and Phil was saying, well, you know, you've really chosen a good, that's amazing, you found somewhere. He said, I've seen some places, you know, you've done so well to find that. And I get, validation, and well, it came across very genuine, and we were ever so lucky to have found that place. And indeed, feeling we could move Mum, that it wasn't acceptable that there were some safeguarding issues in the first home, and things weren't that clean, and it wasn't that attractive. The caregivers there were lovely, I would hasten to say, but there was a few more than peripheral things that caused us to want to move Mum. And you know, we did some legwork on that, Sue especially, but Phil helped us realize that's what we needed to do.
Yeah, I remember he kept saying about, you know, your mum's advocate kind of thing, and absolutely bring it up. And we were always like, oh, we don't want to say anything because, you know, the ladies are lovely, but you know, there's food on the wall and it stinks and it's this and it, and he's like, no, you need to say something. But yeah, I mean, do you remember when we were telling Phil about the farm day? So this is the home that Mum was at until she passed away. Did and still do an awful lot for the residents with extra activities and themed events, and they seem to love any excuse to have a dress up the staff. So there's, you know, any opportunity they're getting dressed up, and they had what was billed as a farm day. So although we were able to visit Mum throughout a time at the care home, there was still sort of restrictions as to how many people and what we could do. So like we could visit in the room, but we couldn't go into the main lounge. So they had this farm day, and it literally was like a mini farm that was brought to the home. And they put videos and photographs, because obviously Mum could never recall any of this. And even if it was to show her a photo of her milking a cow, she'd have no recollection and would almost deny it, you know. But we used to get these little videos that they put on social media, and there was this farm day where Mum's, so they actually didn't have a real cow, Emma, just in case you were wondering.
I was thinking, that's amazing.
Yeah, so it was like a pair of udders so there was a cardboard box, picture this, cardboard box painted like a cow. Jill's laughing. And then there was like a fake tea, so like a marigold glove with milk, or maybe not even milk, and they were taking it in turns to squeeze it into a bucket. And you know, the staff are dressed up with straw hats and bits of corn hanging out the mouth, and these goats on leads. There was welly wanging, I don't know, horseshoe throwing, and like to see my Mum in the background, just being there and joining in to her extent. And then like they had these chickens in chicken in a basket, which sounds a bit wrong, but so they could take them into, because there's some residents who couldn't leave the room, so they'd actually take them, and just to see the joy on the residents' faces, stroking these chickens or like little rabbits. And then the ice cream man pulls up, and they all start going out to get an ice cream from the ice cream van, and everyone's covered in ice cream. And it was so comforting to see these faces, like with this big ring of ice cream. And that's one, I mean, we actually mentioned that in Mum's eulogy, because to think that she got that joy, you know, after months and months of torment, you know, even though she couldn't remember it, we got so much joy to know that she'd ended up somewhere where, you know, she was cared for in the best way that she could be. And I think Phil found it quite sort of funny when we were trying to explain all these activities, and it was like, oh, blimey, you know, that sounds amazing. I might get myself booked in. So yeah,
we've spoken quite a bit about sort of how the sessions and the courses helped you both. How do you think they helped your dad? Because obviously he was, you know, at the start of this, he was 24/7 with Mum, supporting her at home.
It gave him opportunity and a space, so like one-to-one, man-to-man, if you like, to sort of speak freely I think my dad was very much of this mindset that that was his duty, that's what he was going to do. He knew it was rubbish, but that's just how it is. And I think at first he was maybe a bit hesitant as to, well what's going to happen? What am I going to say? I think he thought it was going to be some sort of miracle cure. But obviously, as time went on, he realised there was no cure, there was no miracle, there is no magic solution, you know. And he did speak. I mean, Dad never really sort of said to me, I don't know if he spoke to you, Gill, about what exactly they spoke about, but Phil would sort of reflect back that he'd had a good chat with Dad. And I think maybe he'd got Dad to realise that, you know, he's been doing an awful lot. I think Phil picked up how mentally and physically exhausted Dad was. I mean, Dad would have been 79, 80 at this stage. And I think maybe making Dad realise that, you know, he'd done a fantastic job. He was doing a fantastic job. As a family, we're doing a fantastic job. But sometimes the right thing, the kindest thing, is not always the easiest thing. So, you know, what we wanted to do was keep Mum at home. You know, that's what my dad had promised her, and things like that. And I think from some of the conversations he had with Phil, it made him sort of maybe reflect and think about that. He very much respected Phil's expertise and professionalism. My dad puts a lot on that, doesn't he, Gill? That, you know, somebody who's actually done the job knows what they're talking about. When he realised he'd been a mental health practitioner himself for many years, I think that helped Dad come to terms with some things. My dad's quite stoic, and, you know, you just got to get on with it. And I do think
that Phil kept using.
Yeah.
Very stoic, your dad, isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
But I think, you know, Phil sort of got me dad and sort of like managed to definitely sort of help and guide.
Yeah.
And I didn't really overly ask much, because I thought it's almost like a bit of his time. I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Gill.
Well, what I would say is that the fact that Phil had some sessions with my dad, every session that we had with Phil, and we had dozens of them, Phil would ask about Dad. So any of our deliberations, we always introduced what Dad would be thinking and feeling. And we've got the measure of my dad. We've got great respect for my dad. So it was both from the point of view of considering his feelings, knowing how to ask him about things. Within all of the support and care we were able to give Mum, and some decisions we had to make about her care, then it always, even though Dad wasn't there, he was a known entity, you know, as in Phil had some time, so knew, could kind of preempt, how do you think your dad will react to that? How has he felt after your mum's gone into the residential home? He enabled us to consider Dad all the way through. And that, for Dad, it's been quite strange since Mum's gone, how Dad has spoken specifically and said how much he's appreciated the support that we've been able to give him and what we did for Mum, and that he wouldn't have verbalized that prior to Mum dying. Or, you know, maybe once or twice, you know, he did say thank you for things, but that's just his way. We wouldn't expect him to be expressing his appreciation, but we know, we do know that Dad believes that we all did the right thing. And there were some real hard things about it, and choices. I remember the conversation, I know Sue's alluded to it, where suddenly Mum thought that Dad was having an affair with one of the ladies who'd been coming in and sitting with Mum, for a couple of hours, a couple of times a week, while Dad went and got the paper and went and round Tesco for the yellow stickers, that kind of thing. And therefore having to make that choice of, well, what do we push it and say, Dad, we've got to keep her, or do we, you know, move on, realize Mum's got to a different stage? That, all of those kind of thoughts about Dad's considerations, yeah, again supported by Empowered, and the time when we were chatting to Phil, always bringing Dad's considerations into it.
Thank you so much for your time, both of you. If in one sentence, how would you recommend Empowered to other carers?
You can see we're not very good at being brief.
Yeah.
Because there's so much to share, but let's think.
You got one, Sue? I felt like you were ready to go.
Yeah, I would say tailored support. So if I'm promoting it, so it's the opportunity to receive free tailored support by people that have got a wealth of experience, who understand fully where it's at. You don't need to sugarcoat anything. They've heard it all, they've seen it all. It's non-judgmental, and it's invaluable. You know, it's something for you that you're probably not going to get anywhere else. And you know, you've got to give it a go, basically, because there's not a lot out there that is tailored in the same way that this is. You know, it can be from the comfort of your own home. This is a big long sentence, this, isn't it? It's not really a sentence.
It's a paragraph, if I'm honest.
It's a paragraph. But yeah, it's tailored, specific. Sounds like I'm doing the marketing. It's smart, it's measurable, it's achievable, realistic, and timed. Sorry. You're getting the gist of how me and our kid operate. But yeah, it's something that's delivered free, tailored specifically towards you and your family's circumstances, a wealth of experience, invaluable experience, and yeah, just grab it with both hands, essentially.
You know, I'm just going to edit that down to grab it with both hands.
Yeah.
Grab it.
Oh, to me,
grab it.
Smart, measured, achievable.
What about you, Gill? You've had more time to think.
Oh. Empowered conversations really helped with my communications with Mum, who was on her dementia journey. And it meant that as that progressed, we were able to still communicate as best we could. And then empowered carers. I work in marketing. I'm not very good at a strapline for this, because it's too good to try and be reductive about it. Empowered carers has supported our family while Mum has been on her dementia journey, in both listening, playing back, and really understanding what it's like to be with somebody with dementia. Empowered carers has helped us make some tough decisions, but ultimately the right decisions. And we know that through that support, our mums' end of years were as happy and comfortable as they could be.
Thank you. I thought it'd be about half an hour, but obviously I hadn't met Gill or Sue before, so I'm sorry it's taken longer, but
no, it's fine. We're always happy to have a good chinwag.
Yeah, it feels like it's a bit of a point for you. I know you had your last session with Phil, but it was almost a bit of a point for you to think back about what it meant. You probably didn't do that with, I don't know if you would have done that with Phil, but you know, just what it meant for you, and just dig into a bit of that, really. So it's been lovely for me just listening. You know, I've just been a bystander, so I've just been listening to what's happened and how our work has supported you. So thank you both.
Yeah.